I'm Dr. Banerjee, one of the other oncologists in the myeloma group under Dr. Cowan's leadership here. And so I'll be kind of dovetailing on what he discussed, talking about immunotherapy, a little bit more on that paper by Dr. Till and Dr. Press in terms of how it's evolved really in the last decade. Here are my disclosures. And so all of you, on this audience have seen or been or heard of these drugs. Most people have been on them before. It's worth noting, right, that myeloma therapy is complicated. It's, many different types of drugs being used in many different combinations. Big picture, when I use the word chemotherapy with my patients, I'm referring to drugs that kill rapidly dividing cells, that cause nausea, that cause hair loss, etc. And so, melphalan, which is used in transplant, is one of them. Cyclophosphamide, Cytoxan pills, many of you are familiar with. That's in that category. Then if you skip over the middle for a second at the bottom, you have all sorts of targeted therapies that attack cells from the inside. So proteasome inhibitors, Dr. Cowan alluded to, IMiDs, Revlimid, all of you are quite familiar with lenalidomide. And then in the middle there's all these tools that basically attack the myeloma cells from the outside and or help your immune system to attack them. Myeloma is unlike solid cancers. Many of you know this quite well because people often ask, in solid tumors, in breast cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer, the cancer cells are hiding from the immune system. The immune cells can't get in there. In myeloma, the cells aren't hiding. They're sitting there in your bone marrow saying, come and get me, to the immune system, and the immune system isn't able to get them as well as it can without the help of these drugs. So what these drugs do is they kind of level out the playing field. They let our immune systems realize this is an intruder, let's get rid of it. Many options here. Monoclonal antibodies attack myeloma cells from the outside, what we call naked antibodies. They just attack it and let the immune system go from there. CAR T therapy, Dr. Cowan alluded to, I'll go more into it. So there we engineer your own patient's own T cells to allow them to actually fight the myeloma, kind of force them to recognize the myeloma. And a bispecific antibody that we'll briefly talk about, then my colleague Dr. Cicero will go into it more. Basically, it forces your T cells. So remember that your immune cells normally are, each immune cell is destined to bind to one particular protein for the rest of its life. A bispecific antibody tells it, forget what you're doing, go attack this myeloma cell instead. So really cool things that are in the field here of immunotherapies that are helping the immune system fight myeloma better. Dr. Cowan briefly touched on this, but to go into more detail here, is this a laser pointer? Well, I'll try not to use a pointer because I know this will be recorded afterwards. In terms of how CAR T cells work for the cells, we'll talk about the cells first, then we'll talk about the patient, which is much more important. The cells here, you can see a kind of a clockwise circle happening here. At the bottom left, we collect T cells from the patient. We genetically modify them to basically say, hey, whatever this T cell was destined to do with its life, forget that destiny. We have a more important destiny for you. Put on this chimeric receptor that forces it to recognize the myeloma cell Dr. Cowan alluded to. That's actually pretty easy to do. The hard part actually is then taking it, growing those T cells. T cells are very finicky, so getting them to grow and grow and grow into millions of them and giving them back to the patient. From the patient perspective, this time a counterclockwise circle just to make sure you guys are paying attention. At the top left, you can see apheresis. That is the word for collection of the T cells from the patient, right? Many of you know this. It might seem similar to stem cell collection, but again, we're collecting a different kind of cell entirely with different medications beforehand. We manufacture the T cells into CAR T cells. We have trials of new CAR T therapies open at Fred Hutch where that manufacturing interval is as short as 2 days. But right now, for commercial CAR T therapies, typically several weeks, sometimes a month or two. Once the cells are ready to be infused back into the patient, we use something called lymphodepletion, low-dose chemotherapy, not transplant, not melphalan. It's a small dose of chemo that's designed to basically make your body hungry for these T cells, to make it welcoming of the new T cells when they come back in again. And then at the top, we infuse everything back. So CAR T therapy currently, as of October 2023, is approved for patients who have had at least 4 prior lines of therapy, including at least one IMiD, that's lenalidomide, Revlimid, or pomalidomide, Pomalyst, at least one proteasome inhibitor, that's bortezomib, Velcade, or carfilzomib, Kyprolis, and either daratumumab, Darzalex, or isatuximab, Sarclisa. People ask me this all the time. What is a line of therapy? And so I'm not going to quiz you, but if I were to do multiple choice here, is it A, a relic of our past? Yes. B, is it an unplanned substitution or escalation of treatment? Yes. And so it ends up being both of the above. In brief, in myeloma, counting doesn't make sense. As all of you know, 1 + 1 does not equal 2. If you got induction therapy and then got a transplant, even though it's 2 very different things, it's 1 line of therapy. It's a relic of our past when, some of you, we were diagnosed during this time, all we had was chemotherapy for myeloma. So line of therapy was just how many different kinds of chemotherapy could we use? We've thankfully come a long way since then, but this is confusing. And certainly even sometimes myself and my colleagues would disagree on how many lines of therapy someone has had. And unfortunately, is what we're stuck with in terms of the FDA approval as of right now. But with that in mind, can we move CAR T to earlier lines? So right now, in plain English, right, CAR T is only available for patients where we've had to change therapies in an unexpected manner at least 4 times. Can we move it to earlier? I would love that. Dr. Cowan alluded to that with cilta-cel, and Dr. Cicero will talk about this too. Some of our newer trials with ide-cel, Abecma, and cilta-cel Carvykti do support the use of CAR T in earlier lines. This is one of them. So if you look here, the writing is kind of small, but this was a study, the CARTITUDE-4 study, comparing cilta-cel or Carvykti CAR T versus some what they call standard of care, so some therapies that could be used that were not CAR T. And so cilta-cel clearly beat standard of care in that study. But you can see here in the blue, the top blue line is patients who received cilta-cel after 1 prior line of therapy. The blue line underneath it is patients who received CAR T after 2 or 3 lines of therapy. Kaplan-Meier curves are confusing, but they're the bread and butter of what we do as oncologists. In brief, basically, this is the number of patients, the percents on the y-axis, on the x-axis, number of months. So you can see, for example, at 18 months, or let's say 24 months, for example, if you look at 24 on the bottom right and move your eye up, you can see that around maybe 75% of the patients who got CAR T after 1 prior line of therapy were still in remission. But for the 2 to 3 prior lines of therapy, it was only like 55%. Why might that be? If you give CAR T earlier, obviously the patient is healthier. They haven't been beaten up by as much of the therapy that we've offered them. Their T cells might be healthier, right? Because T cells can also get exhausted, just like human beings can get exhausted. So the earlier we give the CAR T, the T cells might be better equipped to fight the cancer. And then, in general, as with each successive time the myeloma comes back, it often comes back more aggressively. Many of you in the audience have lived through this personally. Or it comes back with more, extramedullary disease outside of the bones, etc. So the earlier we give CAR T, maybe we can intervene on that cycle. That being said, as a caveat, and I'll get to this on the next slide as well, again, you might look at this and say, oh my God, CAR T is always better than the standard of care, the green lines. Again, this standard of care is not the US standard of care that we typically would offer for many of you in this scenario today. So Dr. Cowan alluded to this. At this time, next April, the FDA is set to look at whether Carvykti should be moved to earlier lines of therapy. If they do it, let's say they approve everyone after 1 line of therapy can get CAR T, should we do CAR T for everybody? It's a tricky question. The biggest issue Dr. Cowan alluded to is that CAR T is very complicated. We have to take T cells and slowly finesse them into cancer-fighting CAR T cells. That's very resource intensive, both for the patient and for the company and for the lab and for the cancer center. It's a lot for everybody. Even if CAR T cells grew on trees, so even if CAR Ts were super easy to make, even if you could make them right here, while you're getting your coffee, there's a lot more to it than that. We need hospital beds. We need our nursing colleagues. We need, the T cells have to be basically taken out of the patient, carefully processed, sent to the company, sent back, carefully thawed, brought back to the patient. There's a lot of logistics behind the scene. CAR T isn't a good fit for everybody. So as I alluded to earlier, right now, typically I tell patients CAR T takes about 1 to 2 months to manufacture, what we call the vein-to-vein interval. From the day that the T cells are taken out to the day the CAR T cells are put back in again, I would say 6 to 8 weeks. Sometimes 4 to 6, often 6 to 8. We have a trial open right now where that is down to 3 weeks, which is awesome. Hopefully we can get it down to 1 week in due time, but we're not there yet. For some patients, waiting 6 to 8 weeks is just not practical for them. And for those patients, CAR T is not a good idea. As all of you know, as of right now, CAR T is only available in the state of Washington, in Seattle. And so that's not perfect for everybody. Someone who lives in Montana, someone who lives in Alaska, someone who lives even on this side of the pass, and it's that time of year where you can't get over, this might not be the best therapy for them. And the other thing, again, I'll allude to on the previous slide, I typically, for my patients in second and third relapse, use a CD38 monoclonal antibody like daratumumab, Darzalex, or isatuximab Sarclisa with Kyprolis, carfilzomib, and that kind of a control was not an option in this particular trial. And those regimens do quite well in lines 2 and 3, and those patients might be able to do what they're doing for years without requiring CAR T therapy. On the flip side, the C word, not cancer, but cure. right? The word that all of us, all the oncologists here are always nervous about saying this word to our patient with myeloma because people ask, am I cured? I don't know. I say remission. I say complete response. I say durable remission. Why won't I use the C word, cured? I'll admit it. I'm happy to say that I think we are curing some of our patients. We just don't know who those patients are in advance. That's the tricky part. In some other cancers, you can reliably say that if you give them this therapy, over 60% of them will never have this cancer ever come back. We're not there in myeloma. This is probably the closest we've come. So in cilta-cel Carvykti, which is one of the CAR T products, the earliest study that was done in China that led to this eventual drug being approved, 18% of patients were actually alive and disease-free, totally in remission 5 years out. No therapy for cancer, just completely just in remission. And so you can see there's a Kaplan-Meier curve here. And again, you can see at the very right there, there's one patient there, 78, that's 6 years out on this study, who remains in remission. So it's possible, we just don't know who those patients are. That's the biggest challenge that all of us are working on in our research and so forth. How do we make this cure rate higher? So the flip side of that, well, why does CAR T stop working? So a couple things that can happen. So now we'll go into the details. As was alluded to earlier, this is a lot of information. So we'll keep kind of processing this. Hopefully this slide will be out of date in the next year, which I'll be happy about. We're learning much more about this. I would say there's 3 reasons why CAR T therapy might fail a patient. Either the myeloma cell does something funny, the CAR T cell does something funny, or the TME, the tumor microenvironment, everything else around the myeloma and the bone marrow does something funny. In terms of the myeloma cell, so myeloma cells are wily, and we know that. And that's why all of your testament to the fact that with the patient ingenuity, patience, and a lot of our scientific advances, we can get around that. But this is a problem. What can happen? Myeloma cells can lose BCMA. B-cell maturation antigen is, for all commercially approved CAR T therapies right now, the target of all of them. They look for this one protein in myeloma cells. If the myeloma cells don't express that protein anymore, they become invisible once again to the immune cells. They can stop producing BCMA altogether, or they can mutate it in a way that the T cell can no longer see it. There are all sorts of things that, I'm not that old, but when I was in medical school, I'd never heard of any of these words. Trogocytosis is where the myeloma cell gives its BCMA back to the CAR T cell, and the CAR T cell takes the BCMA and kills itself, what we call T cell fratricide. Sounds like something out of Shakespeare, but that's the T cells killing each other. Weird things can happen, and thanks to innovations at Fred Hutch and other places, we're trying to figure out how to get around this. So how do we get around it? Some of the work here at Fred Hutch, actually most of the work here at Fred Hutch internationally has been happening here. Gamma secretase inhibitors. So again, if the myeloma cell is going to try to shed the BCMA and become invisible again, you can give a drug that prevents it from doing that, forces it to express BCMA at very high levels so the T cell can attack it. We can attack 2 different proteins at once to make it harder for a myeloma cell to squirm away. Or we can target something besides BCMA entirely, and Dr. Sutter will talk about that. So that's a myeloma cell. What about the CAR T cell? So CAR T cells I alluded to earlier, are T cells, and T cells can get exhausted. They can, and that's actually the clinical word we use for it. It's not just me humanizing them. T cells get exhausted, meaning that they're just not able to activate and proliferate and do their job the way that they used to do. That's the biggest issue we run into. It is also possible that the body can treat these CAR T cells as foreign and try to reject them. But the T cell exhaustion is a big issue for us. So how do we get around that? The immune system is a constant network of checks and balances. Autoimmune disorders are a good example of where the checks and balances go awry and the body starts attacking itself. Well, maybe we can, it's not a yes or no, right? Everything with the immune system is nuanced. And if we can use some quote unquote checkpoint inhibitors to just tell the T cell to take your foot off the brake for a little bit longer, maybe that can help. A lot of that work, Dr. Cowan actually is the PI, the principal investigator, the leader of one of this big study that we're presenting at our big ASH meeting later this year. Dr. Steve Rootman was also on the study. We can change how the CAR T cells are made. We can try to make the CAR T cells healthier, rejuvenate them, invigorate them, whatever verb you want to use to make them healthy. We're working on that. There are many studies of technologies to make the T cells healthier. The idea being if they are healthier, stick around for longer. And if this is the issue with the issue is we can't tell if this is the problem. If this is the problem, then I would say, all right, well, if your T cells are a problem, let's give you some new T cells or use something different. Right now, when BCMA CAR T therapy stops working for a patient, I don't have a good way of telling why. But if it's this, that's something that we can definitely work on. And then finally, the TME, the tumor microenvironment. That's everything else in the bone marrow where these cells are hiding. The myeloma cells are sitting in the bone marrow, but it's not just them. They're surrounded by all sorts of other immune cells that they've twisted to kind of, follow what they're asking them to do. And those other cells in the tumor microenvironment, they make it harder for the T cells to get in. And so issues that can happen. So, CAR T cell does work against extramedullary disease, against plasmacytomas, but it's sometimes going to be trickier because the T cells actually have to swim their way through all these hostile cells to get in there. Or there can be other cells in the area. There's something called regulatory T cells that are going to shut these T cells down. So how do we get around that? Ever since that first paper that Dr. Cowan alluded to in his talk, there's been a whole army of puns around the word CAR, right? CAR is chimeric antigen receptor. That's nothing actually to do with an automobile, but we like making jokes with ourselves as we're trying to help cure our patients. So we say, well, why not have a CAR when we can have an armored CAR? And the armored CAR basically can get its way through this hostile tumor microenvironment. There are also such a thing as, instead of a CAR, T cells redirected for universal cytokine-based killing, which sounds like the craziest acronym ever until you see that spells truck. So we're not there for curing our patients yet, but we have good, when that day comes, we'll have a good acronym for what we're calling these things. But so armored cars and trucks can possibly either get through the tumor microenvironment or actually secrete chemicals to help motivate themselves to keep going. Don't let that regulatory T cell slow you down. Keep going, kill that myeloma cell. The other thing that we can do is not keep all of our eggs in one basket. So everything I've discussed so far, both the commercially available CAR T therapies, target the same protein called BCMA, B-cell maturation antibody. You can see a lot of the drugs we target BCMA. So both CAR Ts, teclistamab, elranatamab, we have a rapid infusion CAR, rapid manufacturing CAR T open here, for example. It makes sense. BCMA is found in myeloma cells. In the CARTITUDE-4 study, which is the one I alluded to earlier, of 176 patients who got cilta-cel CAR T therapy, 175 of them saw their blood numbers improve by like 50%, if not more. And so it definitely works. It doesn't work forever, unfortunately. There are some cons with BCMA. So BCMA is found on normal immune cells. And so that means that these patients who get these therapies are at risk of infections, as many of you are well aware. Other things, GPRC5D, that's a mouthful, but that is what's called an orphan receptor. We don't know why it's on the myeloma cells, but it's there. So let's target it. We do have an FDA-approved bispecific antibody called talquetamab that attacks it. Dr. Cicero will talk about that more in her talk. Interestingly, this one doesn't seem to be found on normal immune cells as much, so patients possibly aren't at high of a risk of infection with these. But for reasons that I don't fully understand, GPRC5D is found on myeloma cells, on tongue cells, and skin cells. Kind of a strange combination of things here, but patients getting talquetamab can be at risk of tongue issues, for example, dysgeusia, which is changes in their taste, or skin and nail issues. We also have other proteins in the works. Cevostamab not yet FDA approved, but just as an example of something targeting another product, another antigen as a bispecific antibody. And then CD38. Some of you may be familiar with this word. Anyone who's received daratumumab or isatuximab, so Darzalex or Sarclisa, that's what's being attacked by it. And we have others. We have a trial about to open here at Fred Hutch of a different CD38 attacker, basically will work even in patients where the Darzalex or the Sarclisa stopped working. So let's briefly go into bispecific. And Dr. Cicero will talk about this a bit more in her section right after mine. So bispecific antibodies, also called BiTEs, that's a trademark, so I won't use that term again. But bispecific antibodies, you can see a good example here is an antibody that has two arms and it pulls these two cells together. It pulls a T cell together and a myeloma cell together. Again, so what's actually happening here? The T cell normally, every one of our T cells is normally destined to only attack one thing in its life, if it ever finds it. Otherwise, it just goes around looking for its quote-unquote soulmate, whatever it's destined to attack. Bispecific antibody, basically, whatever word you want to use, distracts it, disorients it, hijacks it, whatever word you want to use that says, whatever you thought you were going to do, forget that. Let's do this instead. Let's kill this stupid myeloma cell. And that's exactly what it does. There are many. So the ones that are starred here are FDA approved. Teclistamab was approved like 51 weeks ago. It was this year. It was a Tuesday. It was in clinic. I think 50 weeks ago. It was approved a year ago. elranatamab and talquetamab both approved 2 months ago in August. So this is a lot of advancement happening very quickly. And there's a lot of other drugs here: linvoseltamab, alnuctamab, ABV383. Forimtamig targets GPRC5D, again, that other protein. Cevostam targets another protein. So there's a lot of cool advances happening here. And so I was asked in my slide deck to say, choosing between CAR T and bispecifics. And so, I get asked this question by patients. I get asked this question when I'm talking to other doctors all the time. In short, there's no one universal answer. The answer is that it completely depends on the patient, not just clinically, but on the patient's values, on the patient's logistical support network to do different kinds of things and so forth. But in general, so the contenders here, so again, CAR T, we take out someone's T cells, we genetically modify them permanently to attack myeloma, and we infuse them back into them after commercially right now about a 1 to 2 month pause. Bispecific antibodies are quote unquote off the shelf. There's no manufacturing in real time required, but you basically give the patient a bispecific immediately that, again, for as long as it's in their blood, distracts their T cells, disorients their T cells, and forces them to attack the myeloma instead. In general, I would say that if you're talking about safety, bispecifics are probably a little bit safer, just because a little bit of a controlled explosion. What do I mean by that? The biggest side effect of CAR T therapy, Dr. Cicero is going to talk about this at length, is something called cytokine release syndrome, CRS, where basically all of a sudden the immune system recognizes millions of cancer cells that have been hiding from it for years. And so most patients will get high fevers. They can get plenty of other issues Dr. Cicero will talk about. With CAR T, once those cells are inside of you, they're just growing and growing and growing. They see their enemy, they attack, they proliferate, and so forth. With bispecifics, you can kind of control that expansion a bit more in a careful manner. On the flip side, CAR T is probably more natural, right? It's a more natural thing for T cells to grow out of their own volition and not be, disoriented by the bispecific every 2 weeks. So CAR T cells probably have better efficacy, and the trials seem to match that. In terms of logistics before starting, I alluded to this, CAR T therapies right now typically require 1 to 2 months. There are trials of CAR T that can be done sooner. There are trials of allogeneic CAR T cells that come from a healthy donor, but we don't really have those yet. So that takes about 1 to 2 months versus the bispecific. From the day I see a patient at clinic and say, time to do a bispecific, I need to get insurance approval, I need to get a hospital bed, and that's it. And I can do that typically in about 1 to 2 weeks at the most. On the flip side, when someone gets one of these therapies, CAR T is way easier. CAR T, some people call it a 1 and done. I call it a 2 and done. The patient has to come in for collection of the T cells, go home, come in for the CAR T cells, be monitored for 28 days, go home. That's it. There's no maintenance with CAR T therapy, at least as of right now, not commercially, not the standard of care to give maintenance after CAR T therapy, and that's it. And again, for example, in the study I mentioned, the Legend-2 study, 18% of patients 5 years later out of CAR T are alive, doing great, no issues, no relapse, no myeloma therapies whatsoever. Bispecific antibodies, on the other hand, again, they work, you can start them right away, but the bispecific antibody only works for as long as it's in the patient's bloodstream to kind of help disorient those T cells. And so by the book, the currently approved bispecific antibodies are given once a week until progression. And that can be years of bispecific antibodies once a week. In real life, I should take that back, elranatamab, the package sort of allows us to space out there every 2 weeks. In real life, for all the bispecifics, we're kind of making them every 2 weeks or even every 4 weeks and so forth. So we're kind of, that phrase, building a plane while you fly it, or flying a plane as you build it, right? You guys know this analogy. That's what we're trying to do with these bispecifics. They're all approved now. We're trying to figure in real time, how do we make the treatment continue to work while not requiring the patient to have to drive into Seattle every single week and deal with the toxicities that come with continued bispecifics. So again, I think this is my last slide, and I have 71 seconds left. Which one should I choose? So again, I've given hour-long lectures just about choosing bispecifics and not CAR T, and here I have 2 minutes to talk about CAR T and bispecifics together. In brief, there's no right answer. Some of you I recognize some of you from my own clinic, so I'm happy to talk about this with you guys when I see you next. Otherwise, talk with your physician, because every case is very unique. And the last thing I'll say is this might be a false dichotomy. We're like academic oncologists like us. We love arguing. We love to argue, and we love to just debate each other. So we try to make this as artificial CAR T versus bispecifics. In reality, it actually might be both. So there may come a time where we say, look, someone got a CAR T therapy and it worked well, but not longer and it working at all. So let's give a bispecific instead. Or we may, and we're actually doing this right now for a patient, using a bispecific to help get rid of a lot of her disease before getting her CAR T to lower the risk of side effects from CAR T. So with that, I will stop. This is one of my favorite quotes. I'll let you read it while I stall for 7 more seconds. And I'll say thank you all for your time.